This is Justin Ford for From the Frontline. Tonight we are dealing with slavery today and setting the captives free. In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Dr. Hammond, this coming Friday is National Women's Day, and you have outreaches planned exposing human trafficking. Why is that so relevant today?
It is relevant today. Our domestic who works at the mission had her daughter kidnapped just a short while ago. Her daughter's 22 years old, and she was on her way back from her work on Saturday midday, and a car came and parked directly in front of her. She was about to cross an intersection, and doors opened and men bustled out and started to force her into the car, along with another girl who she was not related to. And now some friends and neighbors noticed this and informed Joy, and so she of course went to the police, and the police immediately responded saying, we can't begin investigating a missing persons report for 48 hours, which of course within 48 hours human traffic victims are out of the country already. So that's insane, ridiculous and scandalous. Well, fortunately she and her husband didn't take this lying down. Her husband had a friend in a Vodacom company and tracked down her cell phone, and so within 24 hours they'd tracked her cell phone beam to a shack in an informal settlement outside Belleville, and they burst into the shack, and the kidnappers weren't there, but their daughter and this other girl were tied to chairs, masking tape around the mouth and so on, and were thrilled to be rescued, of course. Now, they said they were being told, don't worry, you're going to be making lots of money, you'll be out of the country tomorrow, and they were going to fly them back to Nigeria or something like that. And so that was a happy ending, but that could have been an absolute catastrophe. If we'd waited for the government to officially react, then of course she'd be gone and probably never seen by her family again. But thankfully there was someone who was willing to go further and not take the official go away and come back later when it's too late. My wife's best friend in Salzburg, Austria, told me a while ago how her daughter, when her daughter was just 5 years old, was kidnapped by these criminals in downtown Salzburg. She was in a shopping center in Salzburg. I mean, this is the sound of Music City. You'd think, could there be a safer, more peaceful place on earth? And she was busy at the shopping till, and her daughter was on one of these metallic rocking horses in the square of the shopping mall. And she heard her scream. Obviously, as a mother, she immediately recognized that's her daughter's voice. She dropped everything at the counter, dashed out into the square, and she saw a young man with long hair running up the escalator with her daughter, Veronica, screaming from under his arm. Well, when the mother started shouting as well, this animated the daughter, Veronica, to start fighting more and biting, scratching, and this thug dropped her on the escalator and disappeared. Well, when Wendy went to the local Salzburg police, they said, looking at her age and her complexion, lovely little blonde girl, said almost certainly she is being kidnapped for human trafficking, sex trafficking, for pornography and pedophilia and all that stuff. So, I mean, that's a shock. These things are happening now, and when I started in my missionary work, one of the first fields I got involved in was Hillbrow, doing street evangelism. Hillbrow was about the most gang-ridden, crime-ridden part of South Africa back at that time. I don't think it's much better now, though, mind you, having said that. Well, in the 80s, we used this as training grounds for our missionaries before going across the border into smuggling Bibles into a communist country like Mozambique. We would test them by how they could handle such a rough nightlife environment as Hillbrow. And so while doing that ministry, I came across a girl, Sandy, and she was, a bit drugged out and a bit spaced out, obviously, at first, but in trying to share the gospel with her, I realized that she was, in fact, she was under drugs at the time, and she was a runaway. Her parents are Australians, and they had work in Zimbabwe, in Wankie, not Wankie the game reserve, but Wankie the coal mine. So they were working on a mine there. And Sandy decided to run away from home. And she went to Joburg, the city whose streets are paved with gold and beautiful nightlife. And by the time I got hold of her, she was in a gang, what they called a deb, sort of working for the thugs in this gang. And she was being abused as good as a slave, actually. Well, we got her into the Lord's Place, which was a drug addict rehabilitation place we were using as a base for outreaches in the community, and we'd be bringing people back to them. And because she was under drugs, that's where we took her to get cold turkey and to get protection, place to sleep. She didn't have a home as such. She was just part of this gang. And pretty soon, some pimp, thug, whatever, connecting to this gang came barging into Lord's Place, screaming, bloodthirsty violence, he's going to murder these bleeps who have taken away this Sandy who belongs to them and so on. Well, fortunately, frontline workers are not a bunch of pacifists. We were armed, we were dangerous, we were ready, and guns were cocked, and this chap realized that he was walking into something he was not prepared to handle. He had a knife to threaten us, and we had 9 mils to respond with, and this chap retreated. Well, Sandy's story had a happy ending because we contacted her mother in Wankie. She flew to Joburg. She was reunited with her daughter, took her back home to Zimbabwe and maybe to Australia later, Prison Island. But that was just, again, early in our work discovering slavery is still around today. And I could give a lot of stories about actual slave raids in the classic way up in Sudan when we were working there of Arabs on horseback charging into a village, shooting a whole lot of people and kidnapping some women, having them strapped to ropes, being dragged behind their camels and taken back into the desert where they would be sold in old traditional slave markets. Well, that does happen. In fact, one girl from the Noob Mountains actually wrote the book Slave, My True Story. This book got published. Her story started when she was a teenager. She's in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan, where we've done a lot of missionary work. She was kidnapped by traditional slave raiders, as in camels and all that. She was taken to Khartoum, where she had several owners, and then at some point she was brought up by some diplomat who worked in the London embassy. And so this diplomat had the audacity to bring her into London as a slave. Now, Mende Nazir knew well enough that slavery is illegal in Britain. Britain's a Christian country. Britain's famous for having done a lot to fight the slave trade through the centuries. So everyone seemed to know Britain doesn't support slavery, you know. And the moment a slave hits the British Isles, they are automatically set free. And that's a law going back to the 1700s, actually. So Mende Nazir escaped, sought sanctuary, and published a book, Slave, My True Story. I mean, how up-to-date can you get in that? So this is something that's going on today. People may not think slavery is carrying on, but both traditional and less obvious slavery is taking place today. And this is why we use National Women's Day as an opportunity for awareness. We've produced leaflets, we've got videos, dramatic films to show special meetings, and we'll be setting up displays in some shopping malls where we're allowed to, in order to create awareness and to mobilize people to understand slavery today is a reality, and we can be involved in setting captives free even in our lifetime.
Dr. Hammond, you are inspired and motivated by the legacy of the great Christian reformers. Can you briefly tell us about William Wilberforce in particular?
Yes, now, there's nothing in William Wilberforce's early parliamentary career that indicated what the dramatic impact he would have on world history. William was raised in upper-class privilege. He was educated at Cambridge. William was described as a late-night party-loving unbeliever when he first was elected to Parliament at age 21. But then through reading Philip Doddridge's book, The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, which was published in 1745, William came to a dramatic conversion to Christ. Now, that was in 1785. With a new intellectual rigor, he set himself to redeem his idle years, devoting an average of 9 hours a day to study. And he approached John Newton, the former slave ship captain who had been converted to Christ and later wrote the Amazing Grace hymn, which we've all sung at some stage or listened to. And he asked John Newton, should I leave politics and enter the ministry? Well, John Newton admonished him that to leave his post in Parliament would be desertion from the duty to which God had called him. It is hoped and believed that the Lord has raised you up for the good of his church and for the good of the nation. And so William stayed as effectively a missionary to Parliament. And at the time of his conversion, there were only 2 other evangelical members of Parliament. I mean, imagine that, 2 born-again members of Parliament in the whole of London. But by the time of his death, there were actually over 100 evangelical members in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So William Wilberforce straddled a time of immense secularism and corruption in politics to a time by the time of his death when there was huge amounts of evangelical influence in the parliaments, the mother of parliaments, as many people call it. Well, a key date is 28th of October, 1787. William Wilberforce wrote in his diary, "God Almighty has set before me two great objectives, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of society." And his attention was drawn to the abolitionist cause by the Testonites, a group of Christians who were interested in moral improvements in Britain and abroad. And one of the Testonites was Reverend James Ramsay, who wrote a critique of slavery in the West Indies entitled An Essay on the Treatment and Conversion of African Slaves in the British Sugar Colonies. And this was published in 1784. It was based on observations of the ghastly conditions endured by slaves on the Caribbean plantations. And realizing he is going to war against an extremely profitable business with deeply entrenched financial interests and political support, slavery really paid. I mean, just think of the fact that just about all the sugar in the world at that stage was produced by slaves. And people like William Carey boycotted having sugar in his tea and so on just because sugar was produced by slaves. And, imagine how many people today boycott products made in Red China because Red China is using slaves in these so-called factories. And just about every toy sold in McDonald's and at the Disney World these days is made in China, normally by slaves. And many of those slaves are actually Christians. So it would be akin to people today boycotting Chinese-made toys and so on because of them using slavery in the production of most of these things, to William Wilberforce and William Carey boycotting sugar at that stage because it was produced by slaves. And you can just imagine how intensely they must have felt about that, because most of us like our sugar. Well, on the 12th of May, 1789, William introduced a bill for the abolition of the slave trade with a very stirring 3.5-hour speech, and he moved 12 resolutions against the slave trade. Now, reports described this as the most gripping, moving speech ever delivered in Parliament. And William Wilberforce's close friend, the Prime Minister William Pitt, declared Wilberforce had the greatest natural eloquence of all the men I ever knew. Well, most of the members of Parliament were actually convinced of the rightness of Wilberforce's arguments, but they were fearful that abolition would result in economic disaster. 4% of Britain's trade and income at that stage came from the slave trade. And so the slave traders and the plantation owners were given time to respond, and of course they had a lot of financial interest in this. But tragically, before the next session of Parliament, when this was to be voted on, the French Revolution erupted, 1789, of course, July the 14th, 1789. And the tide of public opinion hardened against abolition in reaction to the anarchy and the mass murder across the Channel. And it wasn't just the deteriorating situation in France. There was a bloody revolt by slaves in Saint-Domingue and massacres by slaves in Haiti, which was a French colony. And this led to further public reticence and panic, which swayed the debate against abolition, believing that abolition would fuel revolution. And so William Wilberforce's bill was defeated. And the fact that Britain had just lost the American colonies and their king, George III, was going insane, and war with France was looming, this didn't help matters. But William Wilberforce became one of the most hated men in Britain as he persisted in raising the case against slavery. And William Wilberforce became the target of scurrilous smear campaigns in the media. Many of the news media was actually owned by the plantation owners and the slave traders. So he was physically assaulted and even the target of attempted murder. People shot at him and he got death threats and jostled by mobs. And yet he persevered. And after a lifetime crusade, William Wilberforce's steadfastness was rewarded with the liberation of all slaves in the British Empire. For the first 20 years of this campaign, he was rejected by almost all of his friends, vilified by his enemies, forsaken by even most churchmen who looked at him as, dangerous because he was going against national policy. And after all, slavery was legal, and Britain's involved in the war. How dare he create any kind of discontent against government policy at this stage? So he was in deep trouble. But every year, William Wilberforce would reintroduce bills against slavery, and every year he faced defeat, but it didn't stop him starting again the next year. So his marathon resilience was even more remarkable when you understand William Wilberforce was short, frail, frequently sick, and he's afflicted with poor eyesight. He suffered from lung problems, he developed a curvature of the spine, and this forced him for the last 18 years of his life to wear a steel and leather girdle as a brace beneath his clothes because of his curved and unhealthy back. But he more than made up for his weak body with a vigorous mind and boundless energy. William was not just an eloquent speaker, he was a generous friend, he was compassionate to strangers, and he passionately believed that we are saved to serve. So William Wilberforce pioneered new ways of raising public opinion to outflank the entrenched corrupt interests of the slave traders and the plantation owners. So William Wilberforce developed the pamphlet wars, petitions, graphic prints, the use of pictures and local societies, and then he introduced voters' guides. William wrote a powerful book, Practical Christianity, which was published in 1797. And this was an instant bestseller in Britain and America. Practical Christianity was translated into French, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, and German. And David Livingstone testified Practical Christianity was one of the most important and influential books he ever read, and it had guided him in his lifelong campaign against the slave trade in Africa as well. So in 1807, 20 years after William Wilberforce first began his crusade, in the middle of Britain's war with France, the Napoleonic Wars, Wilberforce and his team's labours were rewarded with victory. Their moral vision and political momentum for abolition became irreversible. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, on 23rd of February 1807, the Abolition Bill passed the second reading in the House of Commons. A whole new generation of statesmen, inspired by Wilberforce's tenacious example, rose up to speak in favour of abolition, and the motion to abolish the slave trade was carried by an overwhelming 283 votes to only 16 against. And the House rose almost to the man. Great cheers, and gave William Wilberforce the greatest ovation ever seen in British history. And William Wilberforce bent forward in his seat in Parliament, his head in his hands, with tears of gratitude streaming down his face, because his lifelong crusade of 20 years had been crowned with success by Almighty God. The slave trade was abolished, and this was only the first victory in his ongoing campaign to set all the captives free. The slave trade was abolished, but not all slaves were immediately set free. So in 1809, British ships were authorized to search suspected slave ships, even foreign vessels on the high seas. In 1810, Parliament made slave trading a felony, punishable by at least 14 years hard labour. In 1815, the British government insisted on the abolition of the slave trade being included in the international treaty, the Congress of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars. And in 1824, Britain passed a bill equating slavery with piracy and making slave trading punishable by death. Finally, in 1833, while William Wilberforce lay dying, a runner was sent to his house from Parliament to inform him that his lifelong campaign was now successful. By an act of Parliament, all 700,000 slaves in British overseas territories, such as Jamaica, were set free. And he rejoiced, "Thank God I've lived to witness the day in which England is willing to give £20 million sterling for the abolition of slavery." And the extraordinary tenacity which William Wilberforce displayed through 46 years of legislative warfare is an epic of parliamentary endurance, and abolishing the slave trade became the great object of my parliamentary existence, to be the instrument of stopping such a course of wickedness and cruelty as disgraced a Christian country. And so this was a tremendous turning point, because the abolition of slavery in 1833 was, in fact, one of the great turning points of history. Wilberforce and his joyful, dynamic, practical Christianity had persevered against all opposition and was graciously used by Almighty God to bring freedom and life to millions ultimately. And the abolition of slavery was a fruit of Christianity, and it actually made possible a greater century of missions, because by ending the slave trade, it made it possible for people to enter into Africa as missionaries and evangelize, because up till then, the local people would regard any strangers as potential slave traders, and therefore they would flee from them or fight them. And, you know, you couldn't evangelize a continent where slavery was carrying on normally. That just undermined the whole progress of the continent. So plainly you can see the fulfillment of what 2 Corinthians 3:17 says, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." And this is one of the great achievements, to turn a government from just economics and self-interest to being altruistic and concerned for the betterment of strangers. And then they mobilized the Royal Navy for the rest of the 19th century to fight the slave trade. The primary duty of the Royal Navy for the 19th century was searching slave ships, setting captives free, fighting against slave traders. And, just a phenomenal achievement which one man really made happen. It just shows God can work through a single person, although he can't work alone. He does need support. But William Wilberforce managed to be the one who pulled this team together until they were successful.
Having heard about William Wilberforce's story and achievement, one could safely conclude that slavery is a dark relic of the past. Yet in my hand I'm holding a leaflet, and on the cover of the leaflet are the words, "Stop the traffic." Over 50 million are enslaved today. Dr. Hammond, surely this is an exaggeration. Can there really be over 50 million enslaved people in the post-William Wilberforce world?
Sadly, yes. Those who believe the days of slavery are over are mistaken. Many people speak of slavery like it's a relic of the past, but it's not. As Christians have retreated from social and political arenas, and if nations which had once been considered Christian, like America and Britain, now move into what they term the post-Christian era, we're seeing a resurgence of all these pre-Christian evils. And those who reject Christianity will in time embrace all the vices that were outlawed by Christianity. So we're seeing in this apostate age a resurgence of legalized child killing through abortion, the killing of the aged and infirm through euthanasia, the legalization of adultery and polygamy, the legalization of perversion and prostitution, things that used to be crimes are now being celebrated, and a massive resurgence in slavery as well. So at a Christians for Truth conference, Doctors for Life presented a major paper exposing human slavery and prostitution today. And Doctors for Life reported human trafficking has become the third largest international criminal activity after drug trafficking and arms smuggling. I think, though, you can add pharmaceutical industry as a new criminal activity, because that's something else that's coming in, like with all the salvation by vaccination, COVID cults and so on. But drug trafficking and arms smuggling are major, but now it seems that prostitution and human trafficking is the third largest criminal activity in the world. According to the American State Department, approximately 800,000 people are trafficked internationally every year. Now that's excluding the people trafficked within countries, which is also significant. And then according to the International Labour Organization, 50 million people are trafficked and are victims of modern slavery today. According to UNICEF, most trafficked victims are girls between 5 years old and 15 years of age. Girls between 5 and 15 years of age. According to UNICEF, 1.2 million children are trafficked every year. And according to the International Labour Organization, slavery produces about $150 billion. That's US dollars, and it's a billion with a B, not a million with an M. $150 billion, or in South Africa, 2,000 billion rand every year. That's how big the business of human trafficking is. And according to freetheslaves.net, 161 member states of the United Nations are involved in human trafficking, which explains why the UN doesn't do much to fight the slave trade, because the UN is the biggest collection of unelected dictators, mass murderers, gangsters with flags, and human traffickers, not to mention drug dealers in the world today. I mean, most governments in the United Nations are not legitimate governments with an electoral mandate. Most of them are self-appointed criminal enterprises, sadly, which is why the UN does not only not fight slavery very well, but as the Whistleblower book and film showed, they're in fact sometimes involved in human trafficking, such as was documented by Catherine Balkovac in Serbia and the Yugoslav situation. Well, 520,000 are enslaved in Arab states, 2 million are enslaved in the Americas, North and South America, 3.6 million are enslaved in Europe and Central Asia, and 9.2 million are enslaved in Africa. 25 million are enslaved in Asia and the Pacific region, and this all according to freetheslaves.net. And Free the Slaves data comes from global estimates of modern slavery, forced labor and forced marriage, published by Alliance87.org, who focus on the Target 8.7 of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which call for ending violations of human rights such as slavery, trafficking, forced labor, and child labor. And then we've also got the UN International Labour Organization documents of 2014, Profits and Poverty, the Economics of Forced Labor. So although more people are enslaved today than ever before. Slavery represents the smallest percentage of the world's population than at any other time in history. So, yes, we have more slaves today than there was in the days of William Wilberforce, but it's a smaller percentage of the world's total population. So, obviously, his policies had a good impact, but the battle is definitely not over.
So, when we talk about slaves and slavery today, what exactly are we talking about and how is it manifested?
So, 80% of the victims mentioned are women and girls, and as many as 50% of the slaves in the world today are children. The majority of female victims are trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation, prostitution, and so on. There's a strong link between prostitution and human trafficking. In fact, as has been said, that prostitution and pornography are two sides of the same coin, and human trafficking and prostitution are inseparable. The Doctors for Life report included the testimony of one girl from Eastern Europe who was lured across the border in response to job offers for a modeling career. And she was kidnapped, gang raped, made addicted to drugs, enslaved to a life of prostitution. And this prematurely aged her so much that within 4 years her life was over. She died of a drug overdose, which is normal. The average person in forced prostitution and human trafficking and so on only lives about 4 years, and the drugs and so on and abuse really wrecks them. Now, this Eastern European girl's testimony seems to encapsulate the modus operandi of modern slavery or human trafficking. The victim is promised good jobs in the city or overseas. And in many cases, these are girls from Ukraine. You know, the country's at war, it's vulnerable, it's a failed state, it's a corrupt government, and many of their parents are gone. The mothers maybe fled to Poland or Germany, and the father's conscripted into the army and is either dead or not at home, able to protect her. And so they're being offered all sorts of things. You know, you can have a career in entertainment, you can be a waitress, you could be a secretary, you can be a model, whatever they offer is, of course, false job offers. And when they get to the new country, their ID papers are taken away. They're told you owe the traffickers money for the transportation costs, and she can earn money by working as a prostitute. And she's told her family's going to be hurt if she tells the police about her plight. You know, we'll kill your parents or your sister or brother or whoever's back home, and parents if you speak on this. So they're constantly monitored by a trafficker or a pimp. They're never alone. And then they made addicted to drugs offered by the trafficker to numb their emotional and physical pain and to make them desperate that they've got to earn more in order to get more drugs so that they can keep functioning. So they make them addicted.
Surely in the 21st century, slavery is banned worldwide?
You would think so, but not practically. So on the 10th of December, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 4 states, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. That's what the Declaration of Human Rights says from 1948. And although slavery is now abolished de jure, legally in all countries, de facto, it continues to function in different forms. And so around the world, almost exclusively in Asia and Africa, there's a large amount of slavery. Now, we know that the slave trade carries on in Mauritania and in Sudan, but practically we know it's even carrying on in places like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. So according to a 2020 Reuters article, slavery is not a crime in almost half the countries in the world. And although historic laws that once allowed slavery have been scrapped worldwide, researchers for the slavery database run by University of Nottingham's Rights Lab, they found that many of the 193 United Nations member states have not gone on to explicitly criminalize slavery and other exploitation akin to slavery. There's no criminal law against slavery in 94 countries. Almost half the United Nations states have no laws against slavery. Almost two-thirds of the countries apparently failed to criminalize any of the four main practices associated with slavery: serfdom, debt bondage, forced marriage, and child trafficking, except in the context of human trafficking. So researchers note almost all countries have some form of domestic anti-trafficking legislation in place, even if it's not always enforced.
Is South Africa involved in this modern slavery?
Sadly, yes. According to the National Centre for Justice and the Rule of Law, there's between 28,000 to 38,000 children currently being prostituted in South Africa. I said children, so we're not just talking about people, adults, but just up to 38,000 children are being prostituted in South Africa right now. And the victims are often recruited from rural areas or informal settlements where there's no real support structure and defense and protection for them. They're transported to urban centers of like Johannesburg, Cape Town, Pretoria, Bloemfontein, Durban. This, according to the International Organization for Migration, IOM, in their report on internal trafficking in South Africa. And boys under 18 are increasingly being lured into sexual exploitation. This is a disturbing new trend as the LGBTQ movement increases. You can see pedophilia and young boys being used in prostitution is increasingly becoming a thing. And that also according to IOM. And then there's West African syndicates. Now, when you say West African crime syndicates, one's normally talking about Nigerian crime syndicates operating in Pretoria, Port Elizabeth, Johannesburg, Bloemfontein. That wasn't possible pre-94, but since 1994, when the South African Police Service, when the South African Police Force was abolished, it is replaced with the South African Police Service, with many ex-ANC Umkhonto we Sizwe terrorists brought into the police. As you can imagine, the police became less efficient and in many cases far more corrupt. And so what we're seeing is local black South African females are being recruited into this sex trade according to the International Organization on Migration. And the Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga and Limpopo are the main recruitment areas for human trafficking because they're the most corrupt municipal governments in the country. Much like Ukraine is the primary source for recruiting girls into human trafficking in Europe, well, in South Africa, it's the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga provinces. And that's according to US research report published in Die Burger and according to IOM. And incredibly, you might recall, as we were heading into 2010, when we were going to be hosting the World Cup, the then National Police Commissioner and head of Interpol, Jackie Celebi, recommended to Parliament that prostitution be legalized in time for the 2010 Soccer World Cup. I mean, I thought soccer was about playing football, but, what do I know? And he said to Parliament it was essential to legalize prostitution so that we had enough prostitutes available for the people who were traveling to South Africa for the World Cup soccer. And in 2008, ANC parliamentarian George Lekgeto recommended prostitution must be legalized for 2010. About the same time, the Durban municipality announced they were going to create a red light district for the sex industry in Durban for 2010. And later, the head of Interpol and National Police Commissioner Jackie Celebi was removed from office as his extensive links with organized crime was exposed. Apparently, putting a uniform on a terrorist doesn't necessarily make him law-abiding. And Doctors for Life International sent out press statements declaring they were appalled by the fact that South Africa would consider rolling out the welcome mat for organized crime syndicates who trade in human lives, effectively slave traders, to exploit the poor and desperate and force them into the sex trade, so-called, which is just another form of slavery, of course. So Doctors for Life reported approximately 40,000 women and children were trafficked into Germany for the previous World Cup soccer in 2006. And the same could be expected for South Africa's women and children would be used for merchandise to cash in on these events. Pimps, syndicates and drug dealers would be lining their pockets during the World Cup soccer and would not go away after the end of the games. Of course, they'd just get more entrenched. You never managed to get these external crime syndicates working in the old South Africa because our police were too efficient. But now it's a possibility because apparently many of them are open for hire and you can buy or at least rent them. Prostitution is actually an act of violence, and it's intrinsically harmful and it's traumatizing to anyone involved in prostitution. So to talk about legalizing it is just unbelievable. And improving the circumstances in which the prostitute works doesn't reduce the harm done. It's like if you want to legalize murder and assassination so assassinations could be carried out in an efficient way, reduce the number of bystanders hurt and collateral damage. Well, that doesn't change the fact that assassination is wrong. And, same thing with abortion, same thing with prostitution. Legalizing it doesn't reduce the amount of harm done. And so when surveys have been done among sex workers in the streets, when they asked, what do you need, 89% of the 475 surveyed said to leave prostitution. That's what the people in it want. They don't want legalization of their slavery. They want abolition of it. They want freedom. So we should commend Member of Parliament Sherilyn Dudley, who at the time had the courage to call trafficking what it is, slavery. In a statement before Parliament, Sherilyn Dudley called human trafficking and prostitution what it obviously is, which is slavery. And in a report she said, The report funded by the United States Agency for International Development claims crime syndicates of human traffickers are increasing their operations in South Africa. These slave traders are involved in cases and the organizations that are trying to investigate and provide therapy for the victims say human trafficking for sex and slavery is rife in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, the old Transkei. Human rights activists said they feared that things would escalate as the World Cup 2010 was being hosted in the country and drawing near. Said we must urge the government to beef up dedicated police units to close down human trafficker operators, and more must be done to educate South Africans to the dangers of being lured by promises of work, only to find themselves abducted and captive to modern-day slave traders.
So in essence, modern slavery refers to people who are enslaved to work as prostitutes. Is that correct?
Correct. Although prostitution or sex slavery constitutes a significant part of modern slavery, there's also other types of slavery as well, though, being practiced in the world today. Believe it or not, according to statistics provided by freetheslaves.net, about 50% of slaves today, that's 21 million people, toil in forced labor slavery in industries where manual labor is needed, in farming, ranching, logging, mining, fishing, bricklaying, brickmaking, and in service industries like dishwashers, janitors, gardeners, and maids. And so that's half are involved in forced labor. About 12% of the slaves in the world, 4 million, are trapped in forced prostitution or sex slavery. About 37%, 15 million, are trapped in forced marriages, forced marriage slavery, and this is particularly popular in the Middle East and Asia. About 25% of today's slaves are children. So, I mean, that's pretty shocking. We've also documented in Faith Under Fire in Sudan and in the Sudan, the Hidden Holocaust film, the ongoing Islamic slavery in Sudan. And anti-slavery organizations have documented the prevalence of slavery in Mauritania, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and other Middle Eastern countries. And I mentioned earlier Mended Nazir, who published her autobiography, Slave, My True Story, documenting how she was captured in the Nuba Mountains in 1992. She was first a slave to rich Arab families in Khartoum, then in 2002 sold to a Sudanese diplomat in London, where she managed to escape and received political asylum in England, publishing this expose. So there is Islamic slavery in the Middle East. There's also communist slavery in countries like Red China, who make use of huge labor camps to produce cheap items for export. You wonder how China can undercut everyone. Well, when you don't have to pay your workers, it does cut your costs, I suppose. So that's why if you go to America, virtually every toy seems to be made in China. Virtually everything in Disney World is made in China. Even the American flags are made in China. It's absolutely staggering. And from these and many other examples, it should be clear to us the war against slavery is not yet over. And Christianity has always been the greatest movement for liberty. So it shouldn't surprise us that as Christianity is rejected and excluded from the public sphere, we're seeing a resurgence of paganism, as seen at opening ceremonies for the Olympics. And we're seeing infanticide, polygamy, perversion, prostitution, slavery coming back. 2 Peter 2:19 says, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by what a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage or slavery.
Dr. Hammond, can you clarify the terms used? Is what we call a trafficker nowadays the same as what would have been called a slave trader in David Livingstone's day? And does the term trafficker also encompass pimps, brothel madams, or are pimps and madams the new slave drivers?
Yes, I think that's putting it well. Most trafficking rings are run by gangs and organized crime syndicates, such as those mentioned earlier, such as dealing with the World Cup. But it's often smaller rings of people too, such as the brothel and strip club owners, pimps, taxi drivers. It can even be aunts and uncles sometimes selling their nephews and nieces into the slave trade.
I believe that you and your Africa Christian Action Team will soon be handing out Stop the Traffic leaflets around Cape Town. Can you tell us more about this, Dr. Hammond?
Yes, so Friday the 9th of August is National Women's Day. For the last 29 years, every National Women's Day, we've taken it as an opportunity for outreaches, because here's a government talking about women's rights, but they've legalized so many evils like pornography and effectively prostitution, because they're not prosecuting it, even though it remains a crime on the statute books. And so we organize outreaches in different shopping malls, set up displays and stands. We've designed a new pull-up banner for this. Women are not for sale, and making a stand against human trafficking. We've got these stop the traffic leaflets that people can access free on our website, print or share electronically, and we'll of course be distributing thousands of these free on the streets and shopping malls in Cape Town this coming Friday. And so we're always looking for volunteers to help with the outreaches, and some churches and some communities might decide to organize their own, and they can contact us and we can provide them with gospel literature and these stop the traffic leaflets for them to do an awareness program distributing on the streets or in vulnerable communities, because pre-warned is pre-armed. And if we can get people more aware of this, we also have coming up this Thursday night at the Reformation Society before Women's Day, we're going to be screening another one of these anti-trafficking dramatic films, Trade of Innocence, which Mia Sorvino starred in, and that's about a courageous action against human trafficking in East Asia, which is very inspiring. And as one film reviewer said, it's rare that you find a film with so much heart. So we're using films and literature and radio programs like this in order to create better awareness about the danger of human trafficking and how we can set the captives free today.
How long have you been doing Stop the Traffic protests, and how did you get involved in this ministry? Have you encountered slavery during your missions in Africa and Eastern Europe?
Yes, I've certainly encountered slavery during missions in Africa. We've seen this. Slavery is going on in quite a few parts of Africa, but Sudan was most obvious. Literal slavery, people being captured from their villages and taken into slavery, and some of them ending up far afield as Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. So we know about that too. I've also seen it in Eastern Europe, a lot of slavery coming from Ukraine. I've been approached by women on the streets in Eastern Europe who were plainly slaves with pimps in the background coming up and grabbing my arm and trying to get me into the prostitution nonsense. Even had it before that you can be in a hotel overseas like in Eastern Europe, and the person at the desk downstairs gives a key to the prostitute to come into your room middle of the night, and you've got to force this woman out of your room that's coming in trying to seduce you as a guest, because it's such an entrenched activity that even the hotel staff are involved in this trafficking, and many of these girls come from Ukraine. We came across, even in Cape Town, girls from Ukraine being used by a group called House of Rasputin. Well, that's a very evil name, Rasputin, just about destroyed the Russian monarchy. But the House of Rasputin was trafficking Ukrainian girls, and we got the Cape Town Vice Squad involved in exposing that. So we've been doing this now for 29 years. Since 1995, when the government first started Women's Day, we thought, how hypocritical to have legalized pornography, and now you're talking about women's rights. You know, what a bunch of hypocrites in government. So we've tried to use the Women's Days as opportunities for mall outreaches, missions in the mall. Sadly, more and more shopping malls are not willing to let anti-trafficking awareness be setting up tables and displays in their shopping malls. So we're doing more direct action on the streets, going to traffic lights and working along Sea Point and Tableview, beachfronts, distributing literature, getting into conversations with people. And of course, radio programs, electronic emails. People on the email list are getting opportunities to get the links for these different films and these tremendous leaflets and activities like that. So 29 years we've been involved in fighting human trafficking.
Who else is fighting against and raising awareness about slavery today?
Well, there's some good groups. There's Doctors for Life International, and you can go to doctorsforlife.co.za website. There's Escape, S-Cape Safe House, and you can look s-cape.org.za website. They've got contacts, safe houses, telephone numbers. We've got the telephone numbers, the emails, and the websites all on our leaflets and on our website. There's also Stop Trafficking of People, STOP, Stop Trafficking of People. And they've got the website stoptrafficking.org.za. That's a non-profit company. Straatwerk, or street workers, do tremendous work. Their phone number in Cape Town's 021 930 8055. There's the Joseph Movement, and you can look for www.josephmovement.org.za. The Joseph Movement, named after the patriarch Joseph in the Bible, who of course was sold into slavery by his own brothers. So, you know, someone as respected as Joseph in the Bible knows what it is to be human trafficked, literally. And then Africa Christian Action can go to the frontlinemissionsa.org website. We've got an email address, trafficproof@frontline.org.za, and we can send you links, documents, contacts, the leaflet like Stop the Traffic, things like that. And you can contact me personally if you want to organize a team of activists, peter@frontline.org.za, or to use the American term, ZA. So peter@frontline.org.za. There's my personal email address.
What else can we practically do to resist the slave trade, Dr. Hammond?
Well, we can invite Traffic Proof or Stop Trafficking of People, or the Joseph Movement, to present anti-trafficking awareness presentations at our school, church or community group. I mean, that's all very helpful, youth groups and so on. And we can report prostitution to the Vice Squad. The Vice Squad are a unit of the Cape Town Metro Police, specifically tasked with cracking down on the exploitative practice of prostitution. And so over the last few years, they've conducted raids on brothels in Cape Town. They've helped uncover cases of trafficking in human and child prostitution. They've been able to shut down some brothels for not having a business license, and trafficked victims have been taken to shelters, and child prostitutes have been restored to their families where appropriate. Sometimes their parents, sadly, or the uncles and aunts were the pimps and traffickers, so it's not always appropriate to return the children to their families, but where appropriate they have been. So prostitution is still illegal in South Africa according to the Sexual Offences Act, but this law is very seldom enforced by the police service. If you suspect a house in your area may be operating as a brothel, or if streets in your neighborhood are affected by prostitution, you can report this to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is a private body. Their number is 0800 222 777. So it's 0800 222 777. 0800 222 777. That's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And that's for help for yourself or for someone that you know or something you've noticed. And of course, inviting speakers from Traffic Proof or Stop Trafficking of People or Straatwerk to motivate and mobilize your school or youth group or congregation or to pray in action is very practical. You can volunteer your own time or support a shelter. For example, Doctors for Life International run a prostitution relief outreach in Durban and Pietermaritzburg, and they've got telephone numbers, websites. Their number is 032 481 550. And that's Doctors for Life prostitution relief outreaches, and they've helped many people escape from prostitution and find gainful employment.
What resources would you recommend for people who want to learn more about slavery today, and what can be done to expose and oppose it?
Well, go onto the Frontline missionsa.org website, and you'll find you can download this Stop the Traffic leaflet that's got a whole lot of contacts and details, and you can either order copies from us, come and collect some if you're in Cape Town. If you're further afield, you might want to download it and print it locally and distribute to your people, or share it electronically. So frontlinemissionsa.org website's got these leaflets and links to audio and video resources such as this podcast on From the Frontline that you can share. There are different good films that you can show. Tracks we've got on our livingstonfellowship.co.za website include Fight the New Drug, which is fighting pornography, Beveg die Nuwe Dwelm, Women Need Protection, Respect, Vroue verdien beskerming en respect, The Christian Liberation of Women, and then we've got the Women's Day awareness campaigns against human trafficking. Films we recommend that you show is The Trade of Innocence, which is Mira Sorvino's film on East Asia brothels and campaigns to set the captives free. The Sound of Freedom is probably the best film all round made in this. Jim Caviezel's film Sound of Freedom. You can go onto Angel Studios website and be able to get more details about the film and obtain it there. We've got some of our films on fighting slavery available at christianlibertybooks.co.za. There's the film Digital Cocaine, and there's the book Digital Cocaine, also available from CLB. And we've dealt with this on a number of Salt and Light radio programs, which you can find archives to on the Frontline missionsa.org website. Women's Liberation, Human Trafficking Today, Women at Risk on SoundCloud. You can listen to a whole range of programs on this issue that we've broadcast on Christian Perspective on the News, Radio K Pulpit, how the media is sexualizing your children, as also on our website. And you can also see that there are other films, more popular ones, but with unacceptable content that expose human trafficking, like Taken. Nefarious Merchant of Souls is an American documentary film about a whole lot of human trafficking worldwide, and presents from a Christian worldview. Nefarious covers human trafficking in the United States, Western and Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia, and it has reenactments and interviews, and it's a whole lot of very good insight, and it has a strong Christian worldview. The Whistleblower is also a hard film to watch, but it's a 2010 biographical film on the true story of Catherine Bolkovac, a Nebraska police officer recruited to be a United Nations peacekeeper in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the old Yugoslavia, in 1999, where she discovered a Bosnian sex trafficking ring which was bringing Ukrainian girls for sex trafficking. And when she rescued two of the girls and put them in the witness protection program, they were handed by the UN back to the pimps who tortured them to death to terrify the rest of the trafficked girls. And Bolkovac tried to get everyone involved, going all the way up to the head of the General Secretary of the United Nations, and she got fired, forced out the country, and she got death threats and had to flee to Britain, where she won a wrongful dismissal lawsuit and is under witness protection program in Britain. Catherine Bolkovac, the whistleblower, is not able to return to her home country in America because of fear that she'll be assassinated for having exposed the United Nations involvement in the sex traffic today. I must recommend the Sound of Freedom film made in 2023 by Angel Studios, Tim Caviezel's film. This is the best film to expose what human trafficking is today, and it's done in a very restrained way so that it can be shown to Christian and mixed audiences. It's very sensitive in dealing with tough subjects, but it's inspiring and positive because it's a true story where they actually managed to free slaves and bring many of these children home to their families. So Sound of Freedom, we can't recommend that high enough.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about Sound of Freedom, Dr. Allen?
Yes, well, Jim Caviezel plays Tim Ballard, whose story is being captured here. Mira Sorvino plays Ballard's wife, Catherine Ballard, and it's a inspiring story. It's one of the most successful independent films ever produced. It grossed 85 million worldwide, very popular in South America, and the plot is based on Tim Ballard's Operation Underground Railroad, where he, having served 12 years as a U.S. Special Agent for the Department of Homeland Security on the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force and the Child Sex Tourism Jump Team, he resigned just 10 months before his pension time to go and devote his time full-time to trying to rescue trafficked children in South America. And it's a wonderful voice for the voiceless. It's an inspiring story. It has a message of hope, and it's got the biblical message of God's children are not for sale, which has become the movie's anthem and the message the filmmakers want to convey to audiences. So it's a gripping, heartbreaking, but hope-giving movie with a strong Christian moral message that acknowledges God as Father and Creator and sheds a light on the need for strong men and strong women to stand up for God's children all around the world who are caught up in this vicious, abusive system of human trafficking. And it champions the idea that sex trafficking can be defeated. And there's a lot of hope and strength in this film instead of fear. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind.
Thank you for informing us about this modern-day scourge of human trafficking, and we pray that listeners will be inspired to help fight and raise awareness. In closing, we'd like to read from Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Thank you very much for joining us for From the Frontline. God bless and good night.